Today I'd like to share with you my thoughts on an interesting book I came across. I believe it was a recommendation from another book I was reading about Central Asia. I'll include the link down below for that, but I want to focus on this, which is News from Tartary, and as it says below, one of the great classics of travel writing. This is something that we think of as fairly common, or I would think maybe it's more YouTube video of here's the trip I went on, or here's a expedition, or here's the Red Bull, crazy expedition to go skiing in, the Arctic down, blah, blah, blah. But this is now coming up on 100 years old, and the fact that they were able to go from Peking, which is now Beijing, all the way over to Kashmir, and they did it, I believe, in about 7 months, and going through regions that many people had never been through, at least Westerners, or that it had been so long or there was so little information, but we'll get into all of that. So let's talk about the author real quick. It is Peter Fleming. There is a lot of information about him. I'm not going to spend a ton of time. If you're interested, you can certainly look that up. But I will say that from the book, I'm going to read a quick excerpt from this, I think, that to give a little background if you are interested, that he was one of the great travel writers of the 20th century. He lived from 1907 to 1971. He began his career as a special correspondent with the Times and later wrote for The Spectator. He served with the Grenadier Guards during the Second World War, and from 1942 on was in charge of military deception operations in Southeast Asia. He is the author of several classic books, which include Brazilian Adventure, To Peking, Bayonets to Lhasa, and Operation Sea Lion. And let's see, in his memory, the Royal Geographical Society established the Peter Fleming Award for projects that seek to advance geographical science. So personally, I was very happy to come across this. I don't believe I had come across any of his books before. I haven't read any others. However, there is something we're going to touch on where there's a book about this same adventure that I am going to end up reading. Actually, I just found it via interlibrary loan, and I'm going to be reading that. So, okay, we talked about this, but it was a successful trip from what is now Beijing to Kashmir, the India-Pakistan region, into what is more, or used to be more, British-controlled areas, and going from dealing with, the politics and the bureaucracy of centralized China at that time in 1935, moving out through Western China, getting into regions that were under kind of dubious control politically. There's a lot in this book about Russia's influence, or USSR at the time, their influence into these areas, what was going on there. For them, it was unsure if they would even be able to move through some of these areas, and whether or not to do it safely. And you would see in the book at a lot of times they're basically getting lucky, and that they were unsure and they figured they would be turned around. So this was interesting to me too as well, and something that interested me in the book. Peter was traveling with a woman who goes by the name of I'm probably going to mispronounce it. I couldn't find any audio or video of this, but Kini Maillart, a Swiss woman whose first name was Ella, Ella, but this was the name she went by and how they referred to her, how Peter referred to her in the book, so that's what I'll use. An accomplished person of her own with lots of travel, sporting accomplishments, a very interesting life. And previously I mentioned that there's another book on this, and it's her version of this travel. And so I am definitely going to check this book out, because it's really interesting to hear Peter talk about their interactions and how an amazing of a travel partner she was. And it just, for me, was that some of the accomplishments and the things she's done would be pretty amazing at any time point. But to think that this is 100 years ago, and that she was undertaking this trip with Peter, and that she had been doing travels on her own in places like this, was certainly amazing, and comes off as a pretty tough person and able to really accomplish a lot, both physically and mentally. So I found that really, really interesting. So the title of her book, her version of it, is Forbidden Journey, from Peking to Kashmir. So we've talked about this a little bit, but they were traveling at a time where very little was known to most Europeans in any detail about these areas. There's certainly British outposts or British-controlled areas as you move, but as you go further east from the India-Pakistan area, or what is now India and Pakistan, that trails off pretty quickly, and it was considered pretty rough up into some of the Kashmir area and moving out of that, and they were traveling well beyond these regions where in far western China, what is now eastern Afghanistan, and just really incredible. So they mentioned this in the preface, but the maps that existed at that point for their use were generally out of date or just didn't exist. Nobody had detailed maps. Of course, understood that the continent was there, nothing like that. But where's a road? Well, there is no road. There's caravan paths where caravans of camels go, things like that. And they mentioned this as well, but maybe they weren't the first, but one of few, and that even since then, there's been very few people who have completed a journey like this. So it's hard, I think, sometimes to imagine this, but in 1935, the difficulties and everything that there wasn't even a telegraph line across this. That there were mail was delivered in some places by horse. In some places there wasn't necessarily mail. You would add it to a caravan or someone would take it for you, and you just hope that they get somewhere where it could then be passed along. And they talked about this where they did send some letters and some got through and some just disappeared and never made it. And who knows what happened to those. Definitely something they talk about was political instability in Western China, definitely unsure of their safety and ability to cross borders. And something I really like, this is addressed pretty early in the book. And again, I want to read from the book, and Peter is talking about safety. So he says, "For some reason, I was irritated by the last sentence, with its implication that in remote parts of the world one carried weapons with a view to shooting oneself out of tight corners. I have never been in a tight corner myself, but my instincts and my common sense tell me that there are two possible explanations for finding yourself in a position in which you feel that you have got to use firearms in self-defense. Either you have been foolish or you have been unlucky, and the chances are that if you do shoot, you will be committing more folly or incurring more bad luck. The methods of melodrama may serve for an ugly scene. But when the ugly scene is over, you are still a long way from the rescue party and the third act curtain and God Save the King. And if you are, as we rapidly became, entirely dependent for your food, your guides, your transport, in a word, your continued existence, on the goodwill of the local inhabitants, it is as well not to decimate the latter. Even if by holding your fire you rather tamely lose your life, you can in most cases congratulate yourself as you look down from heaven on the unkind waste that you still had to cross, on having chosen wisely between a quick death and a slow one." So I really liked that passage, and I believe it was in response to some of his readers to either as a previous travel, but people were telling him that, oh, well, I would just shoot my way out of anything, and you need to carry a lot of good weapons with you and things like that. And I think that is a very good response. Okay, book breakdown. This can be a quick one. Since this is a travel log, it's really broken down into 7 parts. And the chapters aren't, as important in the sense of here's exactly what happens here. I'm not going to go into detail. It just kind of breaks it up in regions. Like I said, it's not the traditional chapters. And then, okay, great. This is the next part. The maps I want to share with you. So I was able, and unfortunately I had to return it. I don't have it in front of me, but I took pictures of the maps in the book. And there are some gorgeous maps. I love how some of the older books did this, especially with a fold-out map. And I was able to get an out of or an interlibrary loan. And so we can see here, apologize, a little blurry, but we can see this is the overall map, high-level view, if you will, from roughly where they started and then where they ended up. Okay, so traveling east to west. Now, if we go over and we look at a little bit of a zoom in, okay, we can see their route is in the red. That makes it a little easier to trace. We can see where they use trains and where trade routes are out in the western areas as they move. And then down below it, this roughly correlates pretty closely to, you can see here, it almost matches up. This is the elevation. Okay, this is really interesting. So we have 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20 plus thousand feet. And you can see that some of these areas they're traversing are, in the 10 to 15,000 range. So they covered some very high areas as well as some deserts down in the lower regions. And then, of course, some bigger hills too as they come in across various ranges. And they definitely talk about that. So I don't want to spoil it if you end up reading it, but I found this map to be super helpful to refer to again. But Peter does a pretty good job of reminding the reader at what elevation they're at in terms. And when you're on an expedition like this, whether you're on donkey, horse, camel, the weather and the environment is going to play, just the dominating factor in your adventure. So this is helpful, but maybe not totally needed. As I said, he does remind people about this. Okay. So my thoughts and ideas on this pretty quick, a couple things. One, as with nearly every book from decades, or in this case, nearly 100 years ago, there are things that are talked about, that are said, that just either one, don't hold up. It's a different cultural way of looking at things. And whether we want to say political correctness or whatever it is, there's things you look at and you're like, oh man, that's pretty cringy now. And, for me, there's a difference between, okay, is this malicious, evil, bad, or is this the way that people looked at it because either that's what they were taught, that's what they understood, and kind of taking it that way, and just otherwise just kind of moving on, in the sense that he says maybe this group of people were known to be lazy because they live near an oasis or something. I'm just saying, well, okay, that's not necessarily the truth, and that's a really weird way to put it without ever looking into things, but that doesn't negate everything else he talks about. So just some of that to be aware of, depending on how you feel about that. This, for me, I thought it was a fascinating look where he's talking about his interactions with some of the local people, or just when he sees them, or the people he runs across, whether it's white Russians who have escaped and are living in some of these regions, whether it's a common person, it's a group living in various yurts, or it's a prince or a local leader. Just really fascinating looks into these. And they talk about this as well on the travel thought. Sometimes, I put here, sometimes being lucky is what you need, but sometimes luck is just, how it works out. That sometimes things are going to work and sometimes they're not. And in their case, they talk about it a few times. They definitely got lucky, and, their adventure could have completely ended and been turned around, but it just didn't, and it had nothing to do with their skills or anything like that. So in summary, I would recommend this again for anyone interested in the region and the time period. I found this to be an easy read. It's fairly brief, and it's a little light on what we would consider nowadays for a travel or an expedition. But again, looking back to what they were dealing with, the limited ability to everything that they took was either some limited pictures or taking it journaling by hand, writing up afterwards. And so the ability is so different, and so we have to remind ourselves that this isn't the same as it is 10, 20, 30 years ago. This is very different. So overall, really fun, really glad I read this, and I'm really looking forward to diving into Kini's version of this from her point of view and see how that kind of compares. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, comments, anything about it, leave it, and I will get back to you. Thank you.